gratitude for everyone who is here tonight, from both realms, and our gratitude as well for the Tri-State Spiritist Federation, all the directors, who are diligent to do this work, so much love and grace. We pray, Father, that all of us can unify our hearts tonight and send this love to our brother Peter. We pray for divine inspiration, guide his vocal cords, guard his mind and his heart. And may we all be receptive for the messages that he brings to us in this evening. We ask our grace to reach everyone who could not be here with us, all our brothers and sisters who are online, and anyone who might be dear to our hearts. And with gratitude in our hearts, we embrace Peter, and we ask permission to start this lecture. So be it.
So be it.
So I'm going to read his biography. It's much bigger than this. He was very humble. This was now something. Peter Hayes is a worker in from the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, and a member of the board of the directors for the United States Spiritist Federation. He is also an active member of the Tri-State Spiritist Federation. Peter Hayes and his wife, Beth Rosen, have published many children's books with publishers in Colombia, Brazil, and in the United States. Peter is an amazing guitar player, also incredible writer, and one of the beautiful things I have, Carl asked me to be closer to you. One of the things that I personally always pay attention, being nearby Peter, he brings a sense of peace and you change your state of mind. I always had this feeling being nearby him. He really brings us to this serious but joyful state of mind that makes us to reflect a little bit more where we are, the importance of the moment. Love and Light, the Spiritist Center, he is the president, is a very dear place for my heart. I and Angelita have been there for many years receiving treatment and studying, and I pray always for their benefactors, Marco, Elena, and Mauricio. And they are really, I believe, doing incredible work. If you have the opportunity to visit their center, go. Saturday, they have a healing treatment on Saturdays morning with meditation, so many different studies in Portuguese and in English. Take your opportunities, like a beacon of light in Newark, that's worth to go. I went to many years and I'm going to come back.
Oh,
thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here as part of Spiritist Week, which, as Adilson said, is sponsored by the Tri-State Spiritist Federation, and the theme for this week is Paul of Tarsus. And what I'm going to do is focus on some of Paul's reflections on charity. But before we get to that, a little bit of context. 2,000 years ago, in the first century, the Roman Empire looked pretty close to this. It surrounded the Mediterranean Ocean. Ancient Rome began in the 8th century BC, and it stayed fairly close to the area around Rome for a few centuries, and then it began to expand. And then a major turning point was in the year 31 BC, when Emperor Augustus defeated Mark Antony. Mark Antony was involved in the assassination of Julius Caesar. And leading up to that period, there was a lot of civil strife, because the first period of Rome, it was called the Roman Republic. And by the time of Mark Antony and Julius Caesar, and then Emperor Augustine, the Republic was essentially falling apart. By 31 BC, when Emperor Augustus became emperor, actually by 27 BC, he was emperor until 1480. With Emperor Augustus, Rome went from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. The territory had already expanded around the Mediterranean Sea. Also, Rome became more autocratic. In the beginning, when they would conquer a territory, they kind of encouraged the people they conquered to become possible Roman citizens or at least participate in Roman society, depending upon what their background was. But as they kept expanding all the way around the Mediterranean Sea, they just conquered territories. They allowed them to keep their customs in place, but at the same time, they were also imposing taxation. One of the things that the Jews in Jerusalem were very upset about. So Rome was even more autocratic than it was before. This was the time of Paul of Tarsus, 2,000 years ago, and of course, Jesus. As far as we know, Paul was born somewhere around 5 or 6 AD and was most likely executed in 64 AD in Rome. If you look at the way the Roman Empire is laid out, it made travel relatively easier. If you look at this image, these are the roads in ancient Rome. So there was quite an infrastructure in place. These are the trips that Paul went on, the 4 different journeys. Can you imagine trying to travel this much 2,000 years ago, even with roads that were relatively decent, because the Romans were known for their roads? And these are some of the churches that Paul founded. Of the letters that he wrote letters to 7 different churches. It's believed he founded easily 14 churches and maybe as many as 20. But during his 30-year ministry, he was traveling constantly. The Roman Empire's infrastructure is certainly one of the things that kind of helped make Christianity possible. So it's interesting to think about when Jesus came here on earth, when Paul was here on earth. It just happened to be at the same time that the Roman Empire was at the height of its power. And again, relatively speaking, it was easier to travel. And of course, Christianity spread because the early Christians were very determined and very committed to what they were doing. And if we look at what Paul did with all this traveling, the different routes, if you look at the green line at the bottom where he goes through Crete, Malta, Sicily, that was his last journey. And then he winds up in Rome, where again he was most likely executed around 64 AD. This takes a lot of singularity of focus, determination, a huge desire to serve God. It also is a reflection of Paul's anger. Paul, before he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, somewhere around 35 AD, more or less, maybe 36 AD, Paul was a very angry guy. If you look at Acts of the Apostles, which is a kind of sketchy overview, and a lot of it focuses on Paul's activities, Paul approved, it says, the execution of Stephen. Stephen was the first martyr in Christianity, again, somewhere around 36 AD. But if you look at the book from Emmanuel, Paul and Stephen, Emmanuel makes it pretty clear. Paul didn't just approve of Stephen's execution, Paul engineered it. Paul did everything possible to get Stephen executed. The only thing he didn't do was actually throw the stones himself. Paul is very knowledgeable in the laws of Moses. He's in the upper echelons of Jewish religious society. He's part of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin were the group of Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, roughly 70 of them, and they were the ones that saw that Jesus was executed. And they were the caretakers of the laws of Moses, and they ran the Second Temple, which was the Mecca of the Jewish religion at that time. And Paul is shown, according to Emmanuel, Paul was very ambitious. He was the heir apparent to the Rabbi Gamaliel, who was the elderly rabbi who was going to be retiring soon. And so Paul had a bright future ahead of him as being a prominent member of the Jewish religious order. Paul is portrayed as being stubborn, inflexible, proud, kind of arrogant. He's also deeply in love, according to Emmanuel, deeply in love with a woman named Abigail. And the kicker, I don't mean to give away the book, but the surprise in Paul and Stephen's, it so happens that Stephen, who's the first martyr who Paul has executed, turns out to be the brother of the woman he's in love with. But he doesn't realize that, but even when he does begin to realize it, he kind of dismisses it, because his attitude is, if you are going against the laws of Moses by saying this Jesus person is the new Messiah, this is not acceptable, period. So Paul was very determined to uphold the laws of Moses, which meant he persecuted early Christians. Acts of the Apostles makes this very clear. So why am I saying all this? Because when we think about Paul's relationship, his understanding of charity, I think it came from a background in which he was notoriously angry, vindictive, he was a killer, and he was anything but charitable. So he then began to understand later on, after he encounters Jesus and after he goes through all the struggles that he goes through, he begins to have some idea of what charity is really about. So what is charity? Well, here's the dictionary definition: a benevolent goodwill toward love of humanity. A love of humanity. The word love is very prominent in that definition. It's also an instinctive impulse. To be charitable is to be full of love and goodwill for others. Is this something we do naturally, or is it something we have to work at? The other thing about charity that's interesting is how the word charity gets used in the Bible. If you happen to have the Gospel According to Spiritism, the version from the United States Spiritist Federation, and if you happen to have the book Initiation into Spiritism by Teresina Oliveira, which was published for the first time in English early last year, there is a footnote in both of those books about the word charity. And what they point out is that the word charity used to be in the Bible, in the comments that I will share with you in a moment, but it changed. Here's what is meant by that. Earlier version of the Bible would be the King James Bible. So what's the King James Bible? Well, the King James Bible was commissioned by James IV of Scotland and James I of England. James IV of Scotland became King of Scotland when he was about 11 years old. In 1603, he became also King of England. He succeeded Queen Elizabeth I, who was a very powerful queen. And so he oversaw both England and Scotland. And soon after he became King of England, he commissioned a new Bible. They wanted a more modern translation. And that led to the King James Bible, which was published in 1611. Now, if you look at the King James Bible, it's a book that is very widely available today, still popular. The thing is, the King James Bible was written during the time of Shakespeare, because King James was a contemporary of William Shakespeare, the greatest dramatist ever in the English language, and pretty much the greatest dramatist of all time. And if you read the King James Bible, the thing is, sometimes the way people talk, they sound a little too much like Shakespeare. And the reason for that is because the English language hadn't changed yet. Later in the 1600s, you would start having things like the great vowel shift and other changes in the English language that began to modernize the English language to what it is today. But if you look at more recent versions of the Bible, like this one, the English Standard Edition, which came out in 2001, there are some significant changes about the word charity, which I'm going to elaborate on in a moment, but here's the point. By the way, the English Standard Version is often the Bible used in English publications of books on Spiritism when they quote the Bible. They often will use this one. The word charity got taken out of some passages from the King James Bible and was substituted with love. So in a way, the word charity has kind of taken a back seat a little bit to the concept of love. But charity and love are very much like this. So Paul's comments on charity are in 1 Corinthians, which is in chapter 13. It focuses specifically on his comments about charity. 1 Corinthians is the second letter in the New Testament, follows Romans. Most scholars believe that 1 Corinthians really was written by Paul. Not all letters necessarily are believed to have been written by Paul, but most believe 1 Corinthians was one of them, as was Romans. And 1 Corinthians was a letter addressed to the church that Paul set up in Corinth. What is the deal with Corinth? Ancient Corinth was a city, is still in existence, but it was a city that was controlled by the Greeks until the Romans invaded and destroyed it in 146 BC. This is when Rome was expanding. Still the Roman Republic. Civil war wasn't starting completely just yet, but it was getting there. And then what happened to Corinth is that after the Romans destroyed Corinth in 146 BC, it sat for about 100 years. And then Julius Caesar in 46 BC, not long before he was assassinated, decided to rebuild Corinth. So they did. And Corinth was and became a thriving shipping town. And Paul arrives in Corinth around 49 or 50 AD. By then, again, Corinth was very active as a shipping town. And that's because the Isis of Corinth, the strip of land, was both in between the Aegean and the Mediterranean Sea. So Corinth was a very valuable place. Sometimes people said that Corinth was a place of ill repute and people behaving badly. That may or may not have been justified. It depends on the source and how they describe it. So Paul arrives and sets up a church in 4950 AD. And then about 5 years later, in 55 AD, he writes 1 Corinthians. By then, after being in Corinth for roughly a year and a half, Paul moves on. He's actually quite far away when he writes this letter. So why is he writing the letter to the people, the church of Corinth? Because they were not behaving very well. There was a lot of divisions. Some were saying, I follow Paul. Others were saying, I follow Peter. Others were saying, I follow Apollos. Apollos was a charismatic preacher of the day, and so forth. So there was that going on. People were so angry at each other within this church, they were uncharitable, that they were suing each other. And there was even one member of the church who was having an affair with his stepmother, which even by Roman standards was pretty shocking stuff. So Paul had to address a lot of issues. And the main purpose of writing 1 Corinthians is to say, look, you people need to be unified. As for whether you follow me, this guy Paul, or you follow Peter, the apostle, or you follow Apollos, we're all together on the same team. Why are you picking one over the other? We're all serving God. We serve Jesus. So He dispelled with that. And he did other things. As for the one who was having the affair with his stepmother, turn that person out. And maybe that person will come to their senses. So Paul goes through and outlines several things. And then we get to chapter 13. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to spend a little bit of time with this because he starts to talk about the concept of charity. He says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, it got taken, then I have nothing. So some of this got cropped out. My apologies. What I just read to you, this is how it is in the English Standard Version. And just to go back to my point about the King James Bible, this is what it looks like in the King James Bible. So notice that the word love, highlighted in blue on the left, was a substitute for the word charity. In the beginning of the King James, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. A little different from the modern version. But again, the word charity gets removed. So I'm going to spend a little time on that passage I just read. These comments are inspired a little bit by chapter 25 of Initiation into Spiritism by Teresina Oliveira. And the reason for that is because last year I participated in a program or series on YouTube through the U.S. Spiritist Federation called Initiation into Spiritism. And one of the things I did was to talk about chapter 25, which focuses on the subject of charity. And so it's a mix of Teresina Oliveira's reflections and some of my own. He says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, in other words, trivial type things or loftier things, speaking in tongues. Well, in Acts of the Apostles, the early part of Acts of the Apostles is after Jesus has been crucified and the apostles were demoralized and they have to kind of regroup. So in the early part of Acts of the Apostles, during the Pentecost, roughly 50 days or so after the time of the Last Supper, which was a Passover dinner, by the way, the apostles have regrouped. They go to the Second Temple. They receive the Holy Spirit. During the Last Supper, Jesus told the apostles, I'm going to send you the Spirit of truth. And what he was really talking about is the Holy Spirit. He's promising the apostles, you will not be alone. I will be with you. I'm going to send, the Spirit of the Holy Spirit, basically. So in the Acts of the Apostles, they become filled with the Holy Spirit and they begin to speak in tongues. And they're in front of a crowd of people and some are going, wait a minute, I recognize my native language. And somebody else says, wait a minute, I recognize my native language. So different people with different languages were understanding sort of what the apostles are saying. And they were talking about the presence of God. And then somebody else is listening to all these people speaking this gibberish, speaking in tongues, and says, these people are just drunk. Then Peter, the apostle, steps forward and says, no, we are not drunk. It's 9 a.m. And then he starts to explain the significance of what's happening, that basically the Messiah, Jesus, has come. And this was a big shock to everybody who was not familiar with this. Because remember, the Christians, what we call the early Christians, Jesus and his apostles, this was a very obscure sect. And most people in Rome had no idea who they were. Most Romans had never heard of them until later. So Peter is basically, the significance of this moment is that Peter is telling them A new era has come in. And what happens is he persuades 3,000 people, we are told, to convert that same day at the Second Temple under the noses of the same group of people that had Jesus crucified. The message of that moment is the Christian church has been born. So it is a seminal moment. So speaking in tongues was a very dramatic moment. And Paul, when he talks about speaking in tongues, he's not dismissing it per se, but the question that's asked of him is, well, how important should we be speaking in tongues in church? And Paul says, if you put it under the category of 1 to 5, it's 5. It's not that important. So don't worry about speaking in tongues. Because his real point is, if we don't have love within our hearts, in other words, charitable love, big deal. You could speak in tongues all you want. You can say, I've received the inspiration of angels, but what's really in your heart? And then he says, if I have prophetic powers, that could be a reference to mediumship. All of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth, were mediums. The apostles, were they mediums? Oh, yes. Jesus, well. Paul, absolutely. They were all mediums. But, as you may know, the mediums book in the Codification of Spiritism emphasizes that mediumship is what? A physical gift. You can be a great medium, but do you have genuine love in your heart? Because mediumship, first and foremost, is a physical, technical ability. Of course, the medium's morality does play a role. It matters a great deal. But ultimately, it's a physical gift. And so, and then Paul says, if I have prophetic powers and I understand all mysteries, in other words, know something about the spiritual life, which many don't understand. Well, the thing is, when Jesus was talking about this ministry of love, and he was talking about the spiritual life, he was often having to use analogies like farming analogies, agricultural analogies, because it could be pretty abstract stuff, and people didn't necessarily understand what he meant. But Paul is saying, if I have all this knowledge and I have mediumship, and if I have knowledge such as, Teresina Oliveira mentions human science, so that's a more modern reference. If I have lots of knowledge about today's world. In Paul's day, that could be a reference to him knowing the laws of Moses inside and out and being well versed in the law. That's nice if you have that information, and if you have lots of faith. In other words, you have faith in God, a faith in the spiritual facts and so forth. But if you don't have love, then it means absolutely nothing. And then he says, if I give away all I have, which is a reference to material charity, in the King James Version it says, if I give away everything to the poor, basically. So if I sell all my worldly goods and I put on sackcloth and ashes and so forth, I'm demonstrating to everybody that I have lots of faith and I'm a person of God. But if I don't have love in my heart, big deal. It doesn't matter. And then he says, if I deliver up my body to be burned, in other words, a testimony of faith, like the ones given later by the martyrs of Christianity. So Stephen, by the way, Stephen gave himself up. He knew he was likely to die, and he accepted that, as did Paul once he began his ministry. The thing about Stephen is Stephen spoke so eloquently, it made Paul really jealous and envious, and it threatened Paul, because Paul was a good orator. Paul was used to winning arguments when he got into subjects about spiritual matters, and yet Stephen kind of wipes him, mops him up a little bit. And Paul, of course, doesn't like that. So instinctively, Stephen just rubs Paul the wrong way. So part of what's suggested, and this is what Emmanuel tells us in the book Paul and Stephen, is that Paul felt very threatened by Stephen on a lot of different levels. Not only was he saying this Jesus person, whoever this carpenter was, is the Messiah, which was bad enough, but he actually speaks very genuinely, and he's better at it than I am, although Paul couldn't quite admit that. But what Paul is saying here is that Stephen was the real deal. Stephen would offer himself if he had to, and he was okay with that. In fact, what really unnerves Paul is that when Stephen is going to die, Stephen is calm. When Stephen is dying after being stoned, there's a scene between him and Paul, in Paul and Stephen, and Stephen basically has no anger at all towards Paul. And Paul's like, this is weird. How could you react this way? I just had you stoned. So Paul didn't really get it. But later on, Paul, of course, began to understand. So what he's saying is, if you're going to offer yourself up as a martyr, so to speak, you have to do it from a genuine place. You're not doing it to make sure you're in the history books or something like that. In other words, charity must come from a genuine place. And Paul's message affirms what was already in the Hebrew Bible and gets reiterated in the New Testament, which is when Jesus, you probably know this one from Matthew, right? Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. Jesus is asked, what is the most important commandment? And he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. I'm sorry, all your mind. That's how it is in the New Testament. And then he says, and you must love your neighbor as yourself. So he's boiling down the 10 Commandments. This, almost word for word, what Jesus said is also in the book of Deuteronomy from the Jewish Bible, which is chapter 6, verse 5. So it's part of the laws of Moses. The only difference, the very last part, love with all your might. It's that way in Deuteronomy, all your mind in Matthew. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. And if you go to a synagogue nowadays, and you maybe go to a Shabbat service, typically this quote is in there. Also, I think it's in the Gates of Prayer, which is the high holy holiday book used during Yom Kippur, the most important Jewish holiday of the year. That's the Day of Atonement. So just one example of where Judaism and Christianity have far more in common than they don't. There's the difference about whether Jesus is the Messiah or not, but otherwise, just to make a point that, in case you don't know this, all the early Christians were Jews, and Christianity comes from Judaism, period. Most of the ideas were already there. To continue with Corinthians and Paul's comments, these are the next verses 4 through 7. Paul says charity is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own. It is not or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Charity bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Next verses 8 through 11. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. And then he wraps up by saying, when I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now, we see a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. For now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And as I mentioned, if you look at the King James Version, the last line would read something like, so now faith, hope, and charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. So again, charity and love are intertwined with each other, really inseparable. Now, I'm going to go through this and spend a little time on this one as well. When it says that charity is patient, how easy is it to be patient? We struggle with this one a lot, right? Are we patient people? Do we have the patience to get through many things that we experience every day? I remember jokingly hearing at my center a long time ago, when you pray, don't pray for patience, because guess what? You will get tested. So you have to watch out what you ask for, because you just might get it. But patience is part of a natural instinct that we have. Are we patient? Are we not patient? What about kind? Charity is kind. Do we have a natural goodness towards others, a natural goodwill towards others? Or to paraphrase Confucius, this is a paraphrasing a lot, but basically, do you believe in goodness for goodness sake? In other words, are we naturally kind and we don't have an agenda? Because sometimes when we're kind, it's because we're either putting on a mask or we've got something we want in return and stuff like that. But when we're instinctively kind, then that is a act of charity. Love does not envy or boast. Well, envy, I didn't mention in my bio that I have a background in theater. And the theater is a pretty competitive world. So when somebody does well in the theater, you may be genuinely happy for that person, but you may also kind of be going, a little wish that person had, so that sort of thing can happen. Academia is another field where there may be a lot of competition between people. I'm smarter than you are. I've thought of things that you never dreamed of, and I've had insights into that text that you've never thought of, and that kind of thing. So it's human to be envious. I think sometimes Spiritists might be a little envious of one another. They're not supposed to be. We know that we need to overcome that, but sometimes it can happen. So being envious is going through life thinking that somehow somebody else's success or happiness is at my expense personally, which is a distortion. Complete distortion, right? What about boasting? Well, Teresina Oliveira in her book shares with us this quote from Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, verse 3, which is famously Jesus saying, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And that's in giving to the needy. Sometimes when we are charitable, it depends on the kind of charity that we're doing, but we like to be noticed. But how often are we willing to engage in charity in which we, A, don't care if anybody really notices, and B, we don't even remember that we were charitable. Maybe we helped somebody and then we've gone on to something else and we don't even think about it. We're not keeping score. But sometimes people get very angry when they say, I did all this work for this Spiritist center and these people don't appreciate me. What's the matter with these people? That kind of thing. But if that's our attitude, okay, it's understandable, but it's also missing the point about what charity is really about. Because if we're waiting for that reward in some way, somebody to appreciate us, validation, maybe somebody does us a favor in turn, etc., then we're really losing touch with what it means to be charitable. Charity is not arrogant. Well, that can come across in a variety of ways. Maybe somebody is helping others and then their attitude is, you're so lucky to have me. I am God's gift to whatever, and you should appreciate everything that I'm doing. Paul was arrogant at times. Paul was, I'm the best orator about the laws of Moses. I know this better than anybody else, kind of thing, until he ran into Stephen. And then Stephen really. So an attitude of that we think we're somehow superior to others. But arrogance is often rooted in fear and insecurity. So arrogance is something that people can certainly have and be for a long time, but in the long run, when we think about the trajectory of our spiritual journey, arrogance is not sustainable. Charity is not rude. Our background is animal-like. The cave people, 2 million years ago and before, when we were Neanderthals, if we were angry, chances are we just. But evolution tempered those kinds of impulses. But even today, when we are tested in some way, maybe somebody, let's say we're driving and somebody cuts us off, do we let it go and we're not upset, or do we start yelling? Maybe we use bad words and things like that. So what is our natural impulse? Maybe somebody who's close to us is testing our patience. Again, how do we treat them? Do we calm down? Being rude is a more animal-like impulse, somewhat tempered by civilization, but nevertheless an impulse to get even with somebody, to put somebody in their place. And yet it's not charity. Charity does not insist on its own way. Paul is again emphasizing to the church members of Corinth, you need to be unified. And yet, a lot of times when people are in a group, somebody likes to be the control freak. Somebody lives with the attitude, maybe they don't quite acknowledge it, maybe it's subtle, but it's the attitude of my will, my way. I'll be happy to work with all of you. I'll gladly collaborate with you as long as you do what I want. That sort of attitude. But when we don't insist on having our way, naturally, what happens is we learn to give and take. We're not always going to have our way. Those of you who are in a long-term relationship, is it not more successful when there's some give and take between you and your partner, rather than one is always coming on top? That breeds animosity. So it's the opposite of charity. Charity is not irritable or resentful. Let's face it, we get tested all the time. Maybe we're trying to help people, maybe we're trying to do good in the world, and people could care less. People throw it in our face. People are not very nice to us back. Sometimes people don't trust us when we're kind. Sometimes people are very rude as a reaction. How do we react to it? Do we resent them? What if it's somebody we don't like too much and they provoke us in some way? What is our natural impulse? Are we going to be irritable in some way? Did Paul resent Stephen? Oh, yes. Absolutely. Charity does not rejoice at wrongdoing. I'll give you a kind of trivial example. I'll give you a couple of examples, but it just so happens when I was driving here earlier this evening, I was on 46th Street and about 8th Avenue, I think it was, and there was this car in front of me, Connecticut license plate. They were right in the crosswalk. The light went red, and they went shoom, right across. And of course, what happens is the traffic on 8th Avenue was very heavy, so they got stuck and they blocked the box. Now, if I were not a charitable person, I would go, boy, that one's really stupid. I might even sound like a New Yorker. Boy, they're really stupid. They should have known better. You should stay behind and not try to get across when, with this kind of traffic. That would be rejoicing at wrongdoing. It's not a major example, but the point is, when we take delight when others mess up, and you can think of numerous examples where somebody has made a mistake. And when we rejoice at wrongdoing, it's this attitude that somehow I never make these mistakes, which is nonsense. Of course, we all make mistakes. So again, do we enjoy seeing others get into trouble? Maybe one of the reasons people, especially in this country, might criticize the way religion gets practiced, because sometimes, unfortunately, Christianity can have a bad taste in people's mouths. And one of the reasons might be is that sometimes when people are preaching Christianity, they're emphasizing retribution, punishment, you're going to burn in hell, and all that. You're a bunch of sinners. And maybe underneath that, there's a little bit of sadism going on there too. It's like, you're going to get what's coming to you, or if you're a Spiritist, you're going to suffer the effect of cause and effect, and I can't wait to watch. You take a little delight in the fact that that's going to happen. So Paul is saying that obviously is not charity, and we have to be careful, because these may be subtle impulses that we have, but we have to be emotionally honest with ourselves that we're not going down that little rabbit hole. He says, charity rejoices with the truth. There's a quote from Jesus, which is also from Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, by the way, is Matthew chapters 5 to 7. And if you are not terribly familiar with the overall teachings of Jesus, it's a great place to start. It's a wonderful summary of the essential teachings of Jesus' ministry of love. And when he talks about oaths, it's kind of a funny moment, but what Jesus says is, don't take an oath. And then what he says at the end is, let what you say be simply yes or no. I think what he's getting at there is he's saying, don't make promises you can't keep. Be careful. And how often do people say yes to things and they really mean no, or they don't know that they mean no, but they say yes anyways? And how often do people have trouble saying no, and so they say yes instead? So we're not really in touch with ourselves. We're not being grounded enough. And Paul's emphasizing that it's important to rejoice with the truth. It just so happens that tonight, when we were reading the first chapter from Living Spring, there was a quote from Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, I think it was. And I don't have it word for word, but it was something like, in order to be trusted, you have to prove that you're trustworthy. So Paul was saying that to the people in Corinth, the church members. But isn't it not true? Part of rejoicing with the truth is that we be people of our word and that people can trust us. So rejoicing with the truth means a lot of different things. You could do a presentation on that subject alone. But a lot of it has to do with, are we truly emotionally honest with ourselves and with others or not? Or maybe yes sometimes and other times not so much. But should we not be consistently straight with people and honest with people, even if we have to say no at a time when no is not a very comfortable thing to do, but it may be the best thing to do? So again, Jesus said, when you mean yes, say yes, and when you mean no, say no. Charity bears all things. Well, that means a lot. Paul was persecuted. After being the persecutor of the early Christians, after Paul encounters Jesus on the road to Damascus, Paul then starts to go on the very long journey of trying to spread the good news and to tell the world Jesus is the Messiah. Things have changed, and that was difficult. Paul got arrested, beaten. He too, people threw stones at him. you name it, it happened to Paul. So you have to know how to bear all things. Now, thank God, Christians today don't have to go through this kind of struggles, but we have plenty of struggles of our own in today's world. Do we know how to bear them all? Can we get through whatever trials we have, whether it's emotional, health issues, professional issues, family issues, etc.? Can we bear all things? Sometimes it is a huge struggle, but can we regroup and still have the inner strength to move forward? If we can, then we're learning how to be charitable towards ourselves as well as charitable towards others. Charity also, Teresina Oliveira shares in her book Initiation into Spiritism. It's from Luke, where Jesus is on the cross and he is near death, and he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Luke is the only gospel in the New Testament that has this quote, but it says volumes, because Jesus has been punished and persecuted, and he's also talking about people, the crowd that was whipped up into a frenzy. Crucify him, crucify him. Half of them probably didn't even really understand what was going on, but they said crucify him anyways because they were told what to do. Do we not see this all the time where, like, social media, the way, whatever news you follow, do people get whipped up into a frenzy? How much of what we read is really accurate? Because most media outlets have some kind of agenda in what they do. Even if we're telling one another about an event that happened, are we not selective in what we're saying? So this type of filtering is part of human nature. But Jesus is also saying, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do," because they don't have the big picture the way he does. But also, again, he has suffered enormously at this point, and he still can say this. If Jesus had basically been vindictive and angry at these imbeciles for not appreciating my ministry of love, what would have happened? His entire ministry would have collapsed like a house of cards. His ability to endure to the end, bear all things, is crucial. Why? Because there's one word that summarizes probably the most important point of what Christianity is about: forgiveness. When we forgive, we let go. We don't hang on to things, the past wrongs, etc., that can get us into a lot of trouble. So forgiveness is essential to Christianity when we think about what Jesus' ministry is really about. Charity believes all things. In other words, you believe that God is in charge, that we don't have to control everything, we can't. And when we allow God to be in charge, then it is a huge burden off our own shoulders. Hopes all things. But also believes all things is understanding what is going on in the grand scheme of things. So an example is when Jesus says to Judas, when Judas is having Jesus arrested, Jesus says, "Friend, do what you came to do." Jesus knew long before even Judas knew what Judas was going to do, what Judas was going to do. And therefore what happens is that Jesus understands Judas is playing a role in an important story. And it's a mistake to hate Judas and say he was a terrible person. Did he do wrongdoing? Of course he did. He was also behaving like a human being. And also Judas's role in the story of the Passion helps underscore the essential teachings of what Christianity is about: forgiveness. So, and also, it's easier to forgive when we know that God really is in charge to begin with, and that life will continue, and there are reasons why things are happening now. We don't fully understand them, but later on, hopefully we'll have a better understanding and we'll be better off as a result. Charity hopes or endures all things. Enduring is the one who can make it to the very end. And there's a quote, "The one who endures to the end will be saved." Jesus says this in Mark chapter 13, verse 13, in a section called End of the Ages. It's right after Jesus is with some of the apostles. They're at the Second Temple, again, the major site of Jewish worship. And Jesus tells them that the Second Temple is not going to last. And that turned out to be correct, because the Second Temple, in less than 40 years after the time of Jesus, the Second Temple was completely destroyed by Rome as a result of the Jewish rebellion. The Jews were very upset about Roman taxation. There was the different sects involved. There's the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes who were out in the desert. Jesus may or may not have been an Essene, and they're the ones responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way. And then the last group was the Zealots, and they were the fanatics. The Zealots were, let's overthrow Rome, which, they didn't stand a chance. But there was a 4-year war, and Rome, like they often would do, they really came down hard on anyone who tried to stand up against them, and they completely destroyed the Second Temple. If you go to Jerusalem today and you go to the Western Wall, which is a major site for prayer, that's the only part of the Second Temple that can be seen to this day. So the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and that's a major, major historic moment in Jewish history because it led to the diaspora and synagogues all over the world and so forth. So Jesus knew that was happening. And what I'm really getting at here is that when he says the one endures to the end will be saved, right after Jesus tells the apostles the Second Temple's not going to last, he also tells them, you are all going to suffer. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to go through a lot of problems and challenges. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. So he's trying to, warn them that this is not going to be an easy road you're going on, but it's not for nothing either. Okay, love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. Love is a constant. When we think about the natural state of things, is the natural state of things light and love, or is it hatred and anger? Well, Paul is saying love never ends because love is what truly sustains us. It's not just a platonic ideal. Who can stay angry and hateful 100% of the time, all the time? It's impossible. People can hate for a long time, that's true. But we can't endure it. The body can't take it. The soul can't take it. Love, however, sustains us. And then he goes, prophecies, they will pass away. Tongues, they will cease. Again, these things have a role, but they don't last. And then he says, same thing with knowledge. Why knowledge? Because in knowledge, whatever we learn now, it may be very important, but it's liable to change over time. We're liable to learn new knowledge. So science is a great example. Scientists believed one thing in the past, and then they discovered new evidence, and they had to overturn the old theory and replace it with a new one. And that's good. That's progress. Well, spiritually speaking, do we not do a similar thing? Spiritism emphasizes that we retain everything we learn, yes, but do we not also replace old ideas and attitudes with newer ones that are better? And everything I've been talking about in the previous section on charity is about moral charity for the most part. Material charity is not really emphasized by Paul. Material charity has its place. Sometimes donating money or goods can be very useful and important, but emotional charity is what really matters because that has to do with our inner transformation. So, and that's in part why he says, when the perfect come, the partial will pass away. So what's meant by perfect? Connecting to God, connecting to God's divine laws, our own spiritual progress. We're far from perfect, obviously, but as we start to get closer, are we learning more and more? Are we starting to connect to something that's more lasting, like love? So what do we mean by perfect? Do we know how to distinguish between worrying about things that are short-term versus things that are long-term? And then the last section, Paul says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways, and so forth. Here's a question. When did Paul stop being a child? Paul was somewhere around 29 or 30 when he encountered Jesus. So all through his 20s, he was an ambitious, rising star in the Sanhedrin, and he was persecuting Christians. He was having some of them killed. In Paul and Stephen, not long before he heads off to Damascus, he's trying to find Ananias, who's mentioned in Acts of the Apostles. According to Emmanuel, Paul, the woman Paul loved, Abigail, was helped by Ananias. And Paul realizes that, but Ananias is one of these people of the way who's following this crazy Messiah, and he's a threat. So Paul wants to get to Ananias. What does he do? He tortures a young Christian, pardon me, but he pulls out the guy's fingernails in order to find out where Ananias is. Oh, he's in Damascus, is he? Okay, great. I'm going to go get him. So this is the behavior of somebody who's 29, 30. Is this the behavior of an adult? Well, someone who's fanatical. It's certainly not a mature adult, very childish. So when did Paul really become a man? When he encountered Jesus? Did he start? He began a major inner transformation. He started to change from within, and he began to realize, oh my gosh, I have been really horribly wrong. And also, he was willing to accept the consequences of that. He says in Acts, I hear God, I don't really care what happens to me. And he meant it. He wasn't putting on a show there. So when he says, for now we see the mirror dimly, he certainly didn't see things clearly at all. And he says, but then face to face. Well, that could be face to face with Jesus. It could be face to face with ourselves. Paul's belief system before he met Jesus, imagine like a fabric stretched over us. And the fabric is full of holes, and the fabric represents our entire belief system. I see the world this way, and then it starts to crumble in front of us bit by bit. Because while Paul's fanatically chasing after some of the Christians, there's a little bit of self-doubt lurking in there too. This is what Emmanuel points out. And so Paul finally starts to see things face to face. And then he starts to begin to know, or will show fully, even as I've been fully known. So what he's saying in there in part is he's beginning to understand the truth, a deeper truth, and beginning to understand who he really is. Paul's a little bit like Shakespeare's Hamlet, if you know about Hamlet. Hamlet doesn't really know who he is. Did Paul know who he is the first 30 years of his life? No, not really. But then Paul realized that he didn't. He was trying to serve God. He believed what he believed. He was earnest, but he wasn't really going in a direction that was in harmony with God. And then he began to realize his mistake. And then he again wraps up by saying, so now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. So you can have all the faith and hope in the world, and it's important, but love is the one that really is the most essential. So I'm going to start to wrap up. You probably know that this is a well-known maxim in Spiritism. Without charity, there is no salvation. Influenced somewhat by the phrase, without the church, there's no salvation. Well, the church does many wonderful things, but institutions, religious institutions, do have their faults. So if you replace church with charity, charity is a deeper state of being, and it's transformative from within. Therefore, that will set us free. That'll give us genuine salvation. In the Gospel According to Spiritism, chapter 15, the title is Without Charity There's No Salvation. The comments are, the whole moral of Jesus can be summed up as charity and humility. That is to say, in the two virtues contrary to selfishness and pride. In part 3 of the Spirit's book, which are all the divine laws, there's the chapter on the law of progress. And question 785 asks, what are the biggest obstacles to our spiritual progress? Answer, selfishness and pride. So overcoming selfishness, overcoming pride, it's not easy. It takes a long, long time, but that is key to our spiritual progress. Humility and charity, this is what he never ceases to recommend, and of which he himself set an example. As for pride and selfishness, he has never ceased to fight against them, yet he does more than recommend charity. He places it clearly and explicitly as the absolute condition for future happiness. And then the last thing I want to share with you all is in this chapter there is a passage attributed to Paul the Apostle, which is simply, "Dear children, the maxim, without charity there is no salvation," contains the destinies of all human beings on earth as well as in heaven. So let us all meditate on that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm glad that we didn't do only 55 minutes, because usually Tuesday we study 1 hour and 30 minutes.
Oh, oops.
No,
Okay.
that's good.
Yeah, okay.
And I asked him his years, how long is going to take? 55 minutes. But always I feel my heart that we need to respect the time
Okay.
for the pass,
How do we do?
because usually these speaks are also prepared, yeah?
Mhm.
And it happens naturally. We have still 15 minutes,
Mhm.
and we can do some Q&A before he does the final prayer. It's going to be like a collective test. So I have a lot of questions.
Okay. I'll try.
I would like to ask a question first, if
Okay.
you don't mind.
Uh-huh.
When he said, bear all things,
Mm-hmm.
and as I was listening to you, I had the feeling more in the sense of to cope all things.
Cope, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
But could be also the idea to renounce all things?
It can be renounced. It has to do with getting through all things.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to endurance in a way, but the word endure to the end has more to do with staying to the very end of the spiritual journey that we're currently on in this life. In other words, don't commit suicide. But bearing all things is, do we have the perseverance and the persistence and the inner strength to get through anything that is challenging us right now? How many of you, if you're active Spiritists, feel like you get tested all the time?
Every day.
Every day, right? Every moment almost. Normal. The more we try to work on our spiritual progress, the more things will start to happen that may challenge us. We have the ability to bear it. So in English, the word, again, have the resilience from within.
Yeah, because this is going to be my second question.
Okay.
To endure.
Uh-huh.
And that's why I put in words resilience.
Okay.
Because when you say the one who endures to the end will be saved. As his spirits, we know that we're all going to be saved in the sense that we're immortal beings. Yeah,
Right.
we are loved by the
Right.
Creator,
Mhm.
just going through the experience.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the enduring the sense of resilience, as you just brought.
It's certainly connected to resilience, and enduring also is, it's connected to understanding. You could put it this way, understanding that our journey is much longer than it may seem. Because often when we're suffering, well, here's a good example. Have any of you ever been in severe physical pain? every moment feels like eternity when that's happening, right? It's really uncomfortable. It's unbearable. But can we bear it, and can we endure it to the end? Doesn't mean we don't seek help. We should get help. But do we have the ability to, within ourselves, to stick with it? Because anytime we get discouraged or frustrated, or if we happen to be in physical pain, where time just really slows down, do we know that this too shall pass? That's actually a faith couple, so because of that, I've had the pleasure of learning a lot more about Judaism than I did when before I met her. I knew a few things, but I knew more later. And there's that saying, this shall pass. So no matter whatever's going on right now, this too will pass. Do we know that? Because when we're upset, when we're struggling with something, we may feel like this is never going to end, ever. But that's not true.
I think that's how you're thinking.
Yes, absolutely. Of course.
Yeah. The other thing, what is my question? It's interesting because when the gospel preaches, they say the church is like forgiving of all offense, benevolence to all, indulgence to people's flaws.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a word that is still with me. He never used the word beneficence to all. He said benevolence.
Benevolence.
And that goes back to what you said about mature charity. Because it's so easy to devote your life to Spiritist Center, to do things
right.
from the mature perspective, but to be kind, to be patient, to be caring.
Right.
So
I mean, I'm sure you all have this experience here, but I often have people coming up to me. Yeah, go ahead.
Benevolence.
Yeah, a lot of the things I was talking about from 1 Corinthians chapter 13 was focusing on moral charity. So it's interesting that Paul did that. Paul didn't say charities when you give lots of money to the church, for instance. He could have said that, but he didn't. He was really stressing moral charity and all the different parts of moral charity. So it's very telling. Just to repeat, material charity can have its place. Sometimes people really do need money, or they need some kind of help. What about somebody whose place, was burned up in a fire? Maybe they need clothes, maybe they need furniture. So people get together and they try to help them. Medication, exactly. That's perfectly valid, very important. But moral charity has to do with things like, I'm sure you've all had experiences where you know somebody who's upset and they just need somebody to listen to them. So you got to stop what you're doing. Maybe you're in a hurry and you have to get somewhere, but you stop and you listen to them and you take in what they're saying. It's not about trying to solve that person's problems, but they need someone to listen to them. So that's an act of charity. Very important act of charity. There's many examples one could come up with, but
Anybody?
I have a question about when Jesus said to you, just do what you came to do, right?
Yeah, to Judas.
Yeah, so I know that nobody was born to the evil.
Right.
But somehow he said that he came to be a day, right? By accident to the Jesus mission. So it was meant to have that, or could be another way?
Yeah, I mean, the way Spiritism often talks about Jesus is that Jesus knew what was coming before it happens. He had second sight, as it were. So he could see events before they were going to occur. A few examples where that happens. The one I mentioned about him foreseeing the destruction of the second temple is a good one. Because again, that literally did happen like 37 years, more or less, after he was crucified, when he was already gone. And with Judas, Judas is that part of humanity who we betray people. Maybe people try to help us. Maybe people are a force of good and it threatens us. Was that Judas's mission? No, because we always have free will. Judas could have very well decided, I feel the temptation to take that money and betray him, but I won't do it. But it also shows a lack of faith too, that Judas didn't fully trust what was happening here. And he was offered some money. You know, it's just one thing that human beings will do. But was it his destiny? No, I don't think so. Because Spiritism, when it talks about, Spiritism doesn't really, you have to be careful about the word destiny, because destiny sounds like things are fixed and inevitable. And we always have free will. In fact, free will is an essential component to our spiritual progress as a whole. And therefore, we have to take responsibility as a result.
Many years ago, there was a very beautiful lecture here. My son from Belo Horizonte, I don't remember his name now. Gilmar Trivelato. And he said about probability and destiny. Destiny, the only destiny we know for sure, we're going to be born and die again. Until we get perfection. But probability is huge.
Yeah.
And when the spirits program our lives, they work on probabilities.
Right.
They know already based on the collective karmas, on the tendency of humanity,
Right.
Which directions probably will go when you go to pass through some type of experience. For someone with the light of Christ coming on earth, to be betrayed would be a common thing, even today.
Right. Yes.
Imagine someone with that level of goodness. Do you really be holding his hand and walk with him, or turn his back or back to him when you need to be exposed?
Imagine we have a very popular leader running our country. Even if we had a very popular leader, not everyone's going to like that person. Some people will still hate them deeply. So there's that part of it too. I'm tempted to. Have you all seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia? Do you remember that scene where Lawrence is with the two young men and they're traveling in the desert and they run into quicksand and one of them dies that way? And he saves the other one because the other one gets separated. And Lawrence goes to a lot of effort to save this person who's lost in the desert. He insists that they go back and find this guy. They finally save him. And then they bring him, and then later on in the movie, that same person gets into an argument with somebody and kills him. And then in order to maintain the peace, Lawrence has to execute this person, the same person that he saved before. And he saves this guy, gave him a new chance at life, and the guy gets into an argument and kills somebody, or some petty argument. He has to kill him. And one of the Anthony Quinn's character, I don't remember his name now, when he heard what happened, he said, oh, well, it was written. So the attitude, his worldview was, those two were not meant to live anyways. Even if you save that one, he's going to do something. So now, Spiritism, what Adilson was commenting on also is, in the Andre Louis books, what they tell us about reincarnation is there's often enough planning that when a spirit's going to come back to Earth, they're given any reasonably good opportunities to succeed in whatever mission they have. But the book Sex and Destiny, there's a little part of that book that tells us most of us are lucky if we maybe accomplish about 7% of what we're meant to do, which is a little like, but the point being is, we are given a good chance, but we have our free will, we have our flaws and everything. So chances are we're not going to do everything that we could have done, or we may really make wrong decisions. So, yes.
My hearing is not that good. Did you say 7 or 70%?
7. Something low like that. Yeah.
So it's time for final question.
Well, I would say that the difference is what's your natural tendency. Do you know anybody who's a complainer?
I ask because
Yeah.
most of us, we usually,
Complain?
we might complain.
Right. So if we bear with complaint, we complain, we have a lot of drama, but then we do what we need to do. So we may complain in the beginning, but then we don't walk away from the problem. Bearing without complaint is where you just naturally, you realize this is not going to be easy, but you just jump in and do what you have to do. So both have the same result. It's just that the one that's complaining, that's the level that person's at. People who complain habitually, yes, it's childish, but, if that's where we are, it's where we are. And when we're more advanced, hopefully we're at a point where, again, we run into a major problem, we run into the unexpected, and rather than freak out about it, we just accept it and then try to resolve it if we can, or do whatever seems appropriate at the moment. So.
I'm going to go for a final prayer now, and it's like a pass, okay, for everyone. This is the moment, just as confident as you can, and Peter's going to do the final prayer.
Okay.
Turn the light off, press.
We thank you, God, for your presence in our lives each and every moment. We thank you, dear mentors of Spiritist Group, Inner Enlightenment Spiritist Society, and we thank the mentors of Spiritist Group, Love and Light. We thank you for this opportunity to be here to participate in Spiritist Week. May all of us have the guidance as we do our best to learn and to grow each and every day. May we have protection both coming and going. And we ask, dear God, as much as possible, can the conflicts of the world be resolved as peacefully as possible? May those who are prone to extremism, may these forces be tempered, and may more and more people be persuaded to use their free will responsibly. May your light, dear God, be with each and every one of us. May your light kindle within us, and may we spread the light. We are thankful, dear God, to have life. Thankful for the opportunity to do a little bit better today than we did yesterday. And we place ourselves in your hands. And may we have serenity from within. Amen.
Well, thank you once again, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We have our regular studies every Thursday, mediumship, and also Andrea Luiz on Fridays. And on November, which day? Wait. No, it's not. And in November, we're going to have our suicide prevention workshop. We tried to run downstairs, we could not do it, so it's going to be very small in the center, but everybody's welcome to participate. It's organized and sponsored by the First Aid Spiritist Federation. And I think it's a moment now for all of us really to reflect, because there's so many people going through mental imbalance. I do believe that suicidal thoughts will become even larger as time comes by. And it's so important to give the support also for this work that this Senpai is doing for so many years at the Tri-State. So everybody's welcome. Okay, thank you, Peter. And go to this Love and Light. Very special center. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night.